Hi, I'm Anthony Originello, CEO of the Chartered Professionals in Human Resources for BC and Yukon. We represent more than 8,000 members, and as the organization dedicated to advancing the HR profession through education, advocacy, awareness, professional development, as well as our recognized and impactful CPHR designation, we are proud to be a sponsor of this show. We have been the voice of the HR profession since 1942. Learn more about us at cphrbc.ca.
In this episode of Careers That Matter, I'm joined by John F. Helliwell, who's a happiness expert. He's a professor emeritus, I believe, at UBC, and he is a leading advocate on how to be happy in life. John, welcome.
Nice to be here.
How do you describe what your job is?
Well, the thing that keeps me busiest through the year is the production of the World Happiness Report with a team spread around the world. And it's become, ever since its starting more than a dozen years ago, it's become more and more focused and more intensive in terms of the breadth of the research we drawn together to find out about happiness all around the world. So that's a pretty well full-time job.
So what do you do then, like to be able to produce that? How do you go about getting the information that you need to be able to produce the report?
There are a number of surveys that people have done over the years, and the one we use most, because for the World Happiness Report you want to cover the world, is Gallup's World Poll that they have run since 2005 in more than 140 countries, and they measure a lot of the things that are useful for the study of measurement of happiness and then looking at what might produce better lives in different countries at different times.
So you have to pore over those reports.
Well, yes, we've been using this data for 25 years now. So,
how big's your team?
Well, it varies. We actually invite experts in various particular things like the genetics of happiness and the neuroscience of happiness and a variety of other focus points to do work, bringing in their own teams. Our current team, we've got a sort of administrative team now run out of Oxford that keeps track of the report and deals with all the questions and helps make sure everything's coming along, because we're on very tight deadlines. The last of the data don't come in until the end of February, and we come out every March 20th. So we've got to have a long run up. And now we ask invitations for chapters. They're going out next week for next year's report. So it's a sort of year-long process with a crescendo on World Happiness Day when each new report comes out.
So in your work, what does a typical week look like for you? Because I'm sure there isn't a typical work day, but you're building towards something, so you constantly have to work at it. So what would a week look like for you?
Well, I'm very fortunate, and I think a lot of academics or people who work with things that are not sort of on a tight daily schedule. They can organize their time and do things in an appropriate way, in a way that everyone learned to do better if they hadn't already done it during the COVID years. But it was the way we'd always operated. In fact, the COVID years have made it easier for us to run international teams, because we now have they made the social media social, so that we now have international weekly meetings on Zoom of our editorial team, where 10 years ago we would have met on the fringes of a launch event. That would have been the only face-to-face meeting we would have had. And so you can have regular conference meetings from wherever you happen to be. So at Hornby Island, I'm having meetings regularly. So there's this sequence of online meetings, regular, that actually involve a to and fro, and negotiations, and all of these things are happening all the time, all year long. Much more than 10 years ago, when you would have done your own piece and exchanged it by post or email, and and carried on from there. So the schedule is very different. After a report comes out, everybody wants to talk about it. So you've got interviews all over the world, and they're all having to be scheduled and so on. Lots of people wanting to do follow-ups, people wanting to do similar studies in their own country and so on. So it's hard to predict, and it takes a lot of management. But if it's something that you think is important, it's a lot easier to find the time.
It's rewarding.
Just so.
One of the things that we didn't get to talk about in the conversation that we did for Conversations That Matter was this sense of being in a state of flow. I guess when you're deep into it, you're in that state.
It's true.
Yeah. So let's talk about your career. Where'd you go to high school?
Prince of Wales High School, when it was in its previous location on King Edward Avenue.
Wow. So you graduate from high school. Did you say, I know what I want to do? Ultimately in life, I want to be running the World Happiness Report.
Nothing like that. I've tended to flow with the winds of interest. So yes, I wanted to go to university, and I didn't know what I was going to do in university and talk to people in various fields. I ended up doing a degree in commerce and accounting. My family had been an accounting family for generations. And I got to the end of that, and a friend in a carpool said, why don't you apply for a Rhodes Scholarship? Because what are you going to do next year? I don't know. And I said, no way they'd choose somebody like me. And he said, well, we'll think of it this way. What have you got to lose? Have you got anything else you would stand in the way? And I said no. So he said, go for it. So I did. And it was almost just before the deadline. So I just sort of, having been challenged to say, what the hell, throw your hat in the ring, even if you don't think your hat belongs in the ring. And I ended up going to Oxford. And then from an education which was much too focused on things that were much too narrow, I then studied philosophy, politics, and economics, mostly philosophy, for 2 years, and loved it. And it changed my life, and I did well enough that they wanted me to come back and do more, and so then I spent several more years studying and teaching in Oxford, in narrowing down or focusing, because of some jobs I'd had back in Canada, in economics.
So you became an economist.
I did. I'd worked for the Royal Commission on Banking and Finance and Royal Commission on Taxation, a whole range. I worked for many years at the Bank of Canada, building their first economic models, and central banks around the world, helping them to build their economic models. So I was very deep into international relations, so that's World Happiness Report, if you like, thinking about the economic and other links between countries and building models to implement those.
Where along the way did this lead you back to UBC, your alma mater?
Well, I'd been running these research efforts between Oxford and Ottawa, and then came back and made the links between Ottawa and UBC in late 60s. And I didn't get into the happiness game until I'd been invited for several years to go to the visiting chair of Canadian Studies, Mackenzie King Chair at Harvard, and it never seemed right, but eventually we went in 1991, and it was a wonderful thing to do. So follow your nose at the right time is the career lesson, I guess. And the whole family went way to Oxford, so that we all were brand new to Harvard.
Yeah.
And so I was teaching, and Millie was doing courses, and David was in second year, and James in first year, as all as visitors. We had a lovely time. But I then stayed for several years in that chair. And in the course of it, I was working with a lot of first-line social scientists, including Robert Putnam, and I got working with him on what was called social capital, which is about social connections between people and their importance. And it was he who said to me, do you know, there in the States where social capital is greater, they are happier. And I said, what do you mean happier? And he said, oh, didn't you know they have measures of how happy people are? And I said, no, I didn't. And it actually had been happening earlier, but not in my ken. I said, aha, that's either the most important data we've been doing without for 2 centuries, or it ain't. So that's when I then went back to Oxford as Aristotle's research assistant to chase it down.
Wow. So when you look at the course of your career, you said you just followed your nose. Did you not feel, though, that you were also, moving, like you also had control over moving in particular directions?
All of these things were choices by me, following opportunities that good luck or someone else's kindness had opened for me. So I've had lots of people along who've said, come on along and do things. When I obviously took up happiness, I had to become at a late stage in my career a psychologist. And I was just lucky enough to have come in with some skills that matched their skill sets when you start talking about the world, because I knew the world and I knew data, with Danny Kahneman and Ed Diener, who were the 2 shining lights, Ed Diener in positive psychology and Danny Kahneman in cognitive psychology. And so I did projects and books and things with them. So, and that has to be a nice way to live a professional life, if you can somehow find yourself in a new sport, playing with the real pros and having fun doing it. What's not to like it?
So, because much of this program, we're hoping that young people will come across it, and if somebody's watching this interview goes, well, I want to be like you, John F. Helliwell, what would you say was an important personal trait or characteristic that you've learned that you possess that you think has been foundational in your career?
Curiosity is the most essential thing. And it has to then be open-eyed curiosity. And you have to have enough confidence, maybe the wrong word, but to say, what the hell, if this is really interesting, I'm going to drop what I was doing and do this. It doesn't mean you abandon things half done or any of those things. It means when a door opens, for goodness sakes, notice it and go through it if it looks like something interesting and important on the other side.
That's great advice. Thank you.